Welcome. Thank you for being here this afternoon for our concert. Allow me to take this time to thank the members of the Covenant Methodist Church, Reverend Kyle Gatlin, the senior pastor, Laura Grace Holmes, who is the minister of music here at Covenant. And I also want to say a special thanks to the young men who helped us this afternoon to set up our stage after the contemporary service. And Kyle, thank you for the sound system up there in the loft. We are the Wiregrass Community Band. My name is Steve Thompson, and I'm one of the directors of the band. We opened the concert this afternoon with Black Horse Troop March after the national anthem. It was written by John Philip Sousa and arranged by Frederick Fennell. I almost said Millard Fillmore, but that's wrong. Frederick Fennell. The march was written and performed in October of 1925 in Cleveland, Ohio. Sousa, as some people probably don't know this, was an avid horseman. He loved riding horses. And in honor of the Troop A, famously known as the Black Horse Troop of the Ohio National Cavalry, he wrote that song just for them. Frederick Fennell, who at the time was 11 years old, was in attendance at the premiere. And during the performance, he wrote that the cavalry rode up on stage and stood at attention behind the band. We don't have room for the cavalry today. And I'm sure that Kyle and Laura Grace are happy about that. Again, thank you for being here. This afternoon, the band will perform a series of several marches. However, today is a special tribute to an outstanding composer and friend, the late Dr. Robert W. Smith. Robert was born and raised in Delville, Alabama, and played trumpet in the Delville High School Band. After graduation, he attended Troy State University, now known as Troy University, where he was also solo trumpet, and he studied music composition. In addition to writing music early in his career, Robert was actively involved in composing for and directing the Orlando Magic Drum and Bugle Corps. And one of our trumpeters, Andy Hunter, who is with the Bethel Baptist Church here in Dothan, was a member of that band and knew Robert very well. And Andy and Robert were good friends. In 1997, Robert became the director of bands after the retirement of Dr. John M. Long. Robert was an American composer, arranger, and teacher, and is credited with more than 100 published compositions and arrangements. Not bad for a little guy from Delville, Alabama. Unfortunately, untimely, Robert passed away this past September 2003 at the age of 64. At the time of his death, he was on staff at Troy University and was coordinator of music industry program. We take the opportunity today to pay tribute to Robert, and we will be playing several of his compositions. The first composition that we will perform is Silver Wings March. This has a very special meaning to me and should have to everyone in this area. It was composed in honor of the Silver Wings Band, previously stationed at Fort Rucker. And I know that various concert parks and out at Fort Rucker during the 4th of July celebration, y'all probably heard that band many, many times, but it was a great, outstanding band before they disbanded. On a special note, one of our past directors of the community band, the late Jim Choate, was a retired chief warrant officer and was director of the Silver Wings Band at one time. Today, Marcus Hart, an outstanding area musician and recently retired band director with the Fort Novosel School System, comes now to direct Robert's Silver Wings March. Please welcome Marcus Hart. One of the honors of working with the community band is the opportunity that I have to work on a regular basis with James Holmes. James is the director of the bands at Houston Academy, and he makes it possible for our band to rehearse every Monday night at HA. James comes down to conduct Robert Smith's composition, Where the Black Hawk Soars, written as a commemorative work for the dedication ceremony of Brook Point High School in Stafford, Virginia. The music was inspired by the Black Hawk, a figure chosen to represent the new institution. Robert's composition paints a mental picture through melodic shaping to create a soaring line reminiscent of the flight of the hawk. The wind effects in the middle of the piece create the sensation of silent flight. Please welcome again James Holmes as he leads the band in Where the Black Hawk Soars. Thank you, James. I love marches. I'm a march freak. All the bands I've ever directed, I play a lot of marches. My favorite composer of marches is Carl L. King. Carl King was second only to John Philip Sousa when it came to writing marches for bands. And of his 291 works, 185 were marches. I haven't played them all yet, but I'm working on it. In fact, his most famous march, the Barnum and Bailey Favorites, was written while Carl was the band leader for the famed circus, and it's only dwarfed by Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. One of my favorite marches that Carl King wrote is Rough Riders Gallop March, which he wrote in a tribute to President Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Rider Cavalry. The march also, because of his circus background, has a circus flair, as you can see and hear, the female riders on the white stallions around the circus ring, if you know what I'm talking about. The band now performs Rough Riders Gallop March. keep feeling like I'm going to fall off the edge of that thing and embarrass myself in a minute. The community band was formed in 1990 and had its first rehearsal in the old Houston Hotel, which is now the home of WTVY. The band was formed by a gentleman by the name of Tony Whetstone, and many of you probably remember Tony. Tony was a graduate of Troy State University, which again is now Troy University, was band director in his early years in Daleville, and that's where Tony and I met when I was the junior high band director in Enterprise. He later became director at Dothan High School, and before joining the staff at Troy University at Dothan. He and Rhonda had been close personal friends of me and my wife Claudia for many, many years, and Rhonda has a very special place in my heart because she was my son's band director at Honeysuckle Middle School. Robert Smith composed numerous arrangements that display his faith and belief in God. One of our favorites is Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Listen as Robert skillfully weaves another familiar hymn into the piece that I'm sure you will all recognize. It was with great pleasure that I have invited, and he has consented to come and direct the band today. And Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Please welcome Tony Whetstone.
Steve and James for keeping this organization going. Okay? So we're going to play a tune by Robert, and after we get through this tune, I'm going to tell you a little story about Robert. I'll speak a little louder. I'll put on my teacher voice, okay? Ron and I met Robert. He was graduating high school. We were graduating college. Lo and behold, before we got our first job in the medical, we were hired as band directors at Daleville High School in Daleville, Alabama, where Robert had just graduated. Fast forward a couple of years, of course, we were at Daleville. Robert's mother, Miss Grace, was our band booster president. We were in touch with Robert and his sister Pam quite a bit during this time. About 1978-79, Robert started writing some small compositions for our marching band at Daleville. He would write the paper manuscript, pencil on paper, on the staff paper. I paid him $10 for each score that he produced for us. I would take the score, and how many older educators do I have in here? Come on, raise your hand, older educators. Mimeograph machine, okay? Mimeograph, blue ink, okay, purple. I would write out the parts, run them off, and we played those with very good arrangements. During the summers and sometimes during the school year, we would visit Robert at his house, which was Rhonda's and her roommate's house before we got married, and Rhonda secured the house for Robert when he moved to Troy. We would visit Robert. He, of course, had a piano in his house because he was just a great pianist. He'd been playing piano since he was very young. So we would play little tricks with Robert and see if he could, if we could get him so he messed up something. We would say, play us Clown of the Circus. He'd sit there and think a little bit. He'd play something, and you could just close your eyes and you can imagine a clown at the circus. He had a knack of making music that you visually and mentally saw. You could say a camel in the desert. He'd sit there a little bit, he'd pluck out a little tune, and you would swear it was a camel in the desert. And I told Ron at that time, I said, he's a musical genius. He was 19 years old at the time. He's a musical genius. Those manuscripts that he wrote for me in Rhonda, I saved. I saved every one of them. We moved several times. The little gray box, those scores and parts, I moved every time we moved. They're still in the gray box, except 39 years later, I saw Robert in Tampa, Florida, at the Florida Music Educators Association at his booth at Warner Brothers. And I said, Robert, you remember all those tunes you wrote for us back in Daleville in the late 70s? He goes, yeah, I remember those. I said, I still have those scores, all those manuscript scores. He said, you have to be kidding me. I said, no. I said, would you like them? He said, yes, very much I would like them. And if you remember the hurricane that came through Navarre, I forget which one it was a terrible one down the Pittsburgh, Navarre area. It wiped out his house. He had a beach house. And a lot of his, pretty much most of his handwritten manuscript stuff got destroyed. So he said, yes, I desperately want those. So when I got home, I found all those scores in that gray box, still in the little manila folders. I packed them in a big folder and put them in my van because I worked at Arts Music Shop and I was all over the place and I was bumping into Robert here and there. So I thought, let me put them in the van so when I see him next time I can give them to him. It took me 1 year. January of 2019, we got together at AMEA in Birmingham. And I said, Robert, I have these scores. I said, meet me in the cafeteria in about an hour during lunchtime. So I went down, had my folder, I presented those. He was the happiest person to get those scores. And one of his daughters was sitting there, Savannah. She just always went into tears, knowing that 40 years later, here's these manuscript handwritten scores from her dad. They had the RWS up in the corner. Well, what's his music company called right now? RWS Music. So that's just a small, I could tell you several tales about Robert. Just an amazing person. So we're going to play this tune called, you want to do this? Yeah. Okay, all right. Didn't mean to take that much time.
Thank you, Kyle. There, like Tony said, there's so many different stories. One thing I recalled while Tony was talking Tony and a good friend of ours by the name of Johnny Colson, who at the time was band director in Geneva, we all did our masters together. And we used to ride from Delville Enterprise in Geneva to Troy.
Be careful what you say.
I know. But we all had to take a composition course under Dr. Paul Yoder, who at the time was a resident composer at Troy. And Robert was his understudy. And really and truly, I think Robert probably wrote it as well, if not better than Yoder at the time. But the funny thing was Tony and Johnny were incredible. They could do anything. Me, I struggled with everything. And had it not been for Robert, I probably would have failed that course and never got my master's. But anyway, we had some great memories working with Robert during that time. Robert Smith's composition To Challenge the Sky and Heavens Above draws its inspiration from the aerospace industry surrounding Huntsville, Alabama. The creative seed for this composition is found in the novel and subsequent movie, October Sky, about a young Homer Hickam who was the native of West Virginia. Homer became an aerospace engineer and was famous in his work with Wernher von Braun as they designed rockets to send men into space. Tony is going to lead us now in To Challenge the Sky and Heavens Above. Thank you, Tony. The Great Locomotive Chase is one of Robert Smith's most exciting and creative works. In the early years of the Civil War, the railway system that ran 138 miles from Atlanta, Georgia to Chattanooga, Tennessee, was disrupted by a small group of Union soldiers in an attempt to break the transfer of badly needed arms, munitions, and food for the Confederate soldiers in the battlefield. With the intent of destroying the rail system and burning the bridges, 20 Union soldiers commandeered a locomotive with several cars just north of Atlanta. Well, as you might expect, it isn't easy to steal a locomotive. And it takes a little bit of time to get one up to speed. So they were quickly discovered and pursued by yet another train manned by Confederate soldiers, thus beginning the historic locomotive chase. While their efforts were valiant, the Union soldiers failed to complete their mission and jumped from the train prior to reaching Chattanooga. Robert paints a vivid picture as you hear the train sounds and feel the rushing engine along the tracks. Please welcome back to the podium James Holmes as he leads the band in the Great Locomotive Chase. James? I don't know about y'all, but that is a very, very difficult piece to work together because there's so many different voices and things happening all through the piece. But again, great piece and one of our favorites. We're going to end on a light note today. Hogan's Heroes. Everybody remember the show Hogan's Heroes? It was a television sitcom set in a German prisoner of war camp in World War II. It ran 168 episodes from 1965 to 1971. And it was one of my favorites because I was in high school then, and I probably didn't do as much of my homework as I was supposed to do because I was watching Hogan's Heroes all the time. But it centered around Colonel Hogan, who commanded an international crew of Allied prisoners managing a special operations group from within the camp. We all remember the incompetent commandant, Colonel Klink, and especially the bumbling sergeant-at-arms, Sergeant Schultz.
I know nothing!
Thank you, Tom. Several months ago, Sherry and Doug Beamer made a donation to the band with a special request to purchase Hogan's Heroes March. Sherry is our music librarian, and both she and Doug are members of the band. Doug is also a retired warrant officer and flight instructor at Fort Novosel. The band now performs one of my favorite marches from the television show Hogan's Heroes. sit down just a minute, please?
Again, thank you all for coming this afternoon. We greatly appreciate your attendance.